well. Now, if you look at HMRC guidance, what they describe as a qualifying activity, it basically explains that a company can claim R&D tax relief if it carries out a project or projects that seek to achieve an advance in knowledge or capability in a field of science and technology. And you might think, well, that's very good, but I've got no idea how that applies to my business. We're going to come on to that and talk about some case studies. It also, therefore, goes on to talk about an uncertainty would exist and whether something's possible or technologically feasible if it isn't readily available or deducible by a competent professional working in the field. Well, do you know, I can explain that, and this will come out in some of the case studies as well. Basically, you can be looking to do something in the field of R&D if the information is already out there. In other words, a decent search on the internet or even the local library, and you can get hold of that information, then it's not really R&D because you can basically find that information already. But I'm going to move on now to the first of a number of short case studies, really just to give you an idea in practical terms what R&D might be. So the first case I'm going to talk about is a claim that I did several years ago. The company in question had a beautiful business model. They were buying pharmaceutical products from Southeast Asia, bringing them back to the UK, storing them, and then selling them on wholesale, making a profit, and the company was generally making a profit of £200,000–300,000 each year. Very simple model. At this point, don't get hung up on the fact that it's pharmaceutical product. That isn't the issue for R&D. It could have just as easily been car spares or sort of China dolls for that matter. So anyway, we had this successful company, and the director wanted to have a chat about potential R&D, so I trotted over to North London to see him. And he was a very intelligent chap, and he explained to me that over the course of the last year or so, he'd been developing a management system for his business. It was directly connected to his trade, and this particular management system, if you like, worked real time to extract information from the internet, including things like currency exchange rates, product costings, transport charges, plane and boat, to actually bring stuff over to the UK, sales prices in the UK, and ultimately, if you like, there was a very, I can't think of the word, a sexy little algorithm to kind of pull this information together really so that at any one time he could see what the cost effectiveness was of various products that he was buying and selling, and the system could go further and actually give him a detailed report. If you bought this particular product in this volume from these people and you shipped it back as opposed to using air freight, and then you sold it to such and such a person, this would be your most profitable line. Now this was quite interesting because, I mean, the question that you might ask is, well, is this the first guy in the UK to actually develop a system of this nature? My answer is I couldn't tell you. There's a lot of companies out there, but the point is it doesn't have to be. The information for the chap to actually build this system was not readily available. You couldn't buy a package off the shelf of W.H. Smith, a little bit like a Word or an Excel document, something to plug in. It was something that had to be built from scratch. The guy had to actually go to some IT specialists. He also employed for a couple of years on a sort of fixed-term contract, I think, a couple of IT people to literally help build this with the specialists. And at the end of the day, we had something that was directly connected to his trade, something that assisted him in his trade. Basically, there was a resolution in the field of science and technology. So it was a successful claim. The revenue paid out. They didn't raise any questions on it at all. And as I said, I think this is quite an interesting case study to start with, because if you were to generally ask people what is research and development, the two stock answers that come back would be, well, it's got to be a pharmaceutical company sort of trying to develop the cure for cancer or a common cold, and you'd be absolutely right. Another one would be an IT company developing superconductor Ethernet cable, and I've acted for a company that did this, and again, you'd be absolutely right. Cable that goes twice as far, taking information twice as quick at half the price. And you could see that these two examples can generally be applied, and you'd think, well, okay, but this benefits mankind. What about something I'm doing in my company, improving my own management systems or my own processes? I'm not exactly benefiting mankind, and the answer is you don't have to. You can be looking at something within your company, and a management system like this is a prime example, okay, and still qualify for R&D relief. The next case study I'm going to talk about really just reinforces the fact about information being readily available to someone in the field. Now, this isn't a case that I was involved in, but I know the man that was, and it's to do with a UK motor racing team. Now, this particular motor racing team, whose name I won't say, but if you're anything to do with Formula One, you could probably have a good guess, were carrying out R&D activities in basically trying to make their cars go faster. I would say quicker than competitors, but I would say, let's just say they were trying to be as quick as their competitors because they weren't overly successful. And it involved the fine-tuning and redesigning of the engine, aerodynamics of the car, the weight of the car, the fuel management efficiency, etc. And because it was a UK limited company, a claim was put in by my colleague, and the revenue initially got back and raised a pretty obvious question. Well, you know, you're competing with some of these worldwide teams, I don't know, sort of Honda, Mercedes, Ferrari, etc. And they've carried out an awful lot of research and development. You're only trying to get your car up to that standard. Surely the information is out there already. It's a pretty good question, but it's also a pretty dim question, really, because as was pointed out to them, it's funny that when you've got a team like Ferrari or McLaren or whatever that spends 50 million on their R&D, what they don't do in the end is to go and produce a booklet that you can download from Google, print 200 pages and say this is how we get our engine and our car to go just as quick. They don't do that. So the point is, although someone's already carried out the R&D, if it's not readily available, you can essentially go and carry out the same research and development and still get a qualifying deduction from HMRC. I'm going to move on to another case study now. This is a case of not R&D because I think it's useful sometimes to do a bit of compare and contrast rather than just examples of what is. A while ago I spoke to the director of a company that made wooden garden furniture and also made a lot of money making bespoke tree houses. And he explained to me that people would come along to him with large gardens and with large trees, and basically say, I want a tree house and I want it to be spectacular so I can look at the neighbours and feel I've got one up on them, etc., because their tree house is a lot smaller. And he went into a lot of detail about the fact that every tree house is bespoke and it's designed, and you need to understand about safety and load-bearing applications. And at the end of the day, did I think this was R&D? And it was unfortunate because the answer is no. There isn't any scientific uncertainty, and there is no resolution in the field of science and technology in a case like this. You could say, in simple terms, the information as to how to build a tree house is out there, because you could ask any one of probably 100,000 carpenters in the UK, could you build a tree house and do you understand about joints and load-bearing structures? And they would say yes. It's just a case of how it's all pulled together. At this point, I'm really just going to touch on a couple of other things that are asked of me on a few occasions as to whether it qualifies as R&D. And the first is a spreadsheet. I've had companies come to me and say, well, we put a lot of our management information onto these fancy Dan spreadsheets, and the formulas are awesome. If you look in the Excel workbook, there's 10 or 20 tabs that go on and everything cuts across, and we can interrogate this and get all sorts of information, and it's wonderful. It's if you like a spreadsheet like I do, it's almost like nerd heaven. But the information to write a spreadsheet is out there. People know how to do this. It can be the most wonderful spreadsheet, but in itself, it's never going to be research and development. Another one, slightly more common and relevant, is websites. And I have people say, well, I've just created a website for the business. And there's all sorts of stuff that goes on. You can drill through and look at the team and meet the team, and you can look at their profiles and pictures, and it's what we do and what it costs. And unfortunately, whilst I think every good business should have a website like that, in itself, the creation of a website is not going to be R&D. Having said that, there are occasionally things to do with websites which might qualify. I'm working with a company at the moment pulling a claim together where the website itself has got a degree of interaction where you can actually drag and drop certain things into it and actually work on the website and come to a conclusion and a question and a pricing sort of question that you can ask of the company. And I have to be honest, the technology to do that isn't readily available. It's having to be written, and there's more than likely going to be a claim that goes in with that. So websites themselves might not be, but if there's some sort of behind the scenes back-end work that sort of is maybe innovative and not necessarily out there, there could be a claim for that. I'm going to move on with a couple more case studies, again trying to make it practical, trying to give you food for thought to think, well, we might be doing something similar to that in our company. The next case study is a company that essentially does security equipment, including doors and units and cabinets. And basically, they were for years building doors and units, etc., where there were different ways of getting through the door, such as like standard combinations, keys, just like you would imagine any sort of security door. But then they decided to think about upgrading their product range and moving into a particular area that wasn't necessarily being explored and the information wasn't out there. They were looking at ways where if people tried to actually get through a door without the right either combinations or keys, or in a particular time frame where they weren't expecting people to go through a door, say between 1 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning, then there was some electronic stuff that was being written that would provide real-time information on who was trying to get in, or basically whether someone was trying to get into a particular lock cabinet or a particular door, and it could be transferred to a security company or the director of a company. I appreciate this is all very up in the air and a bit wishy-washy. The trouble is with this is I can't go into specifics about some of these cases. They're very recent. The R&D work that is being carried out and has been carried out is very recent. This particular case resulted in a claim of about £50,000 being repaid. But ultimately the lesson to be learned on this is it's a company looking to innovate within its own trade and within science and technology. So there is R&D. Admittedly, no one's going to obviously benefit apart from the company doing it, but the revenue agreed it without challenge, and as I said, there was quite a substantial repayment. Another case study which highlights the point about companies looking at what they do and sort of upgrading what they do is I dealt with a claim with a company that ultimately deals with CCTV systems, and they've basically started looking at software, electronic design, 3G connectivity, the uploading of images, improving images, transportable USB storage, and external network connectivity. Now again, you might think, what is he talking about? I guess in simple terms, it's a company that builds and installs CCTV cameras, but the information can be relayed, I think, further and quicker and with a lot more sort of connectivity, etc., with directors and with security agencies. And again, it is a bit wishy-washy because it's another case that I can't go into with specifics. But that case was agreed as well, and again, it was getting on for £50,000 that was paid out by HMRC. Now, I'm going to stop it there on the subject of case studies. What I would say is this: the lesson to be learned is it doesn't have to be a life-changing event. It can just relate to the company. It should be connected to science and technology. And I think any decent, competent R&D professional in the field would be happy to speak to you. If you think you're doing R&D, I would rather, I would rather honestly speak to 20 people and find one claim than speak to no people and find no claims, to be honest. So if you do have any questions, please, if you can't actually get through today or I can't see any questions coming in, please do feel free to ring me. I'd love to have a chat with you. And again, I'll just give my contact details before I go on to sort of the expenses and the claim process. Again, my number at Raffingers is 0208 418 2671, and my email is Neill with 2 L's, N-E-I-L-L, @raffingers.co.uk. So I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about the expenses that can be claimed and just generally the process as to sort of what it involves. So the sort of expenses that are claimable within R&D, they are a lot different to the expenses that are generally allowable as a deduction from profits in company accounts. And generally speaking, there are three sorts of expenses that populate a very average R&D claim. The first is staffing costs. Now this is basically what it says on the tin. If you have an employee, which can include a director, could be more than one employee, that works for you as an employee, and they carry out a proportion of their time doing R&D work, and to be clear, this should be, it's R&D work they should be doing rather than peripheral work, as in sort of researching sort of whether there's something that might be an R&D project. Basically, a percentage of their salary costs can be claimed as an R&D expense. I'll give you a very brief example just in terms of monetary, what a claim could be. And that would be is that if you've got an employee who's, say, on £50,000 a year and will say that approximately 50% of his time is spent doing R&D, you do the math. It is essentially £25,000 can become an R&D expense. And I'll explain shortly how that actually works in terms of the accounts and the computations. You may know already that R&D expenditure can be uplifted, and it's different between the SME scheme and the large company scheme, but currently the SME scheme, the uplift is 230%. If we were to do a claim now, it's quite possible that it would span different percentages, because prior to April it was 225%, but it is literally a case of just prorating the expenditure across the period and uplifting accordingly. If that whole 25% was uplifted at 230%, you would end up with an R&D deduction of about 32,500. Now, you might look at the math and think 25,000 times 230% gives you a little bit more than 32,500. The point is you've already had relief for 100% of that cost, because it's already sitting in the profit and loss, and it's already been designated as a salary cost. Your uplift is actually 130%. So based on this one example, a salary, 50 grand at 50%, 25,000, uplifted to 32,500. That's an automatic deduction as for corporation tax. So your saving would be £6,500 purely on that. Alternatively, if you were in a loss situation already, you could surrender that loss for tax credits. Currently the surrender rate is 14.5%. You could give up that loss for just over £4,700, and that's a check in the post. I'm going to stay on expenses rather than getting too much into the computation side at this stage, because there are some other expenses that can be claimed. Another one which is quite common is when you have subcontracted R&D costs. Now, this is very different to a consultancy payment. A consultancy would be when you're paying someone £2,000, £3,000, £5,000 or £10,000 a month, and they come in and drift around your business and generally help out doing things. That in itself is not an R&D cost. Consultancy is just not part of the R&D claim process. A subcontracted cost is when you actually need a particular thing to happen, or you want a product to do something different, and you go to an external person, which can be a person or a company, and you give them the project. You say, I want this to do this, I want you to write me a program that does this, and they say, okay. And when it comes back, hopefully it works, the payments that you make to that person are treated and can be classified as subcontracted R&D costs. There are some restrictions that need to be made. It's limited to 65% of the expenditure. The subcontractor can be connected to the company, but again, there's certain other considerations that need to be made about connected party transactions, but ultimately a claim can be made. The third major part is something called consumable materials. Now, I'm going to be honest, if you're working on a management system, then there's very little, if anything, that's going to be claimed in terms of consumable materials. But if what you're doing is a little bit more hands-on, and possibly you're actually welding certain things together or mixing products together or creating prototypes which at the end of it produce something that has been helpful in the R&D process but can't really be used for anything else, then you can see that you've basically got materials which have been consumed, they've been used for the purpose of R&D. And those materials which are ultimately sitting in stock and in the accounts will be sitting in cost of sales, it is reasonable to sort of quantify the actual cost of those materials, and again you can enhance it by 230 or 225%, and you can claim R&D just as we did with the staffing costs. There are a few other peripheral costs which, to be honest, I'm not going to waste time with today, but basically these are the three types of expenses which form the basis of most R&D claims. Now I'm going to talk now about the claim process, because generally when I speak to people for the first time, they're a little bit concerned. How's it going to affect my balance sheet? Have I got to restate my accounts? Going forward, have I got to call R&D expenses, and how does that work with things like salary costs, etc.? And it's a lot more straightforward than you would imagine. So the claim process itself is, for those of you who are involved in limited companies and have been through the process of submitting accounts and returns to HMRC, your accountant, presumably us, would have sent you accounts and a tax computation and a form CT600, which is the end of year tax return for a company. And when you look at the tax computation, which I'm sure you all do, for a trading company, it starts off with a profit per account, and then you would add back what you're not allowed to claim, which is things like depreciation and some entertaining. And then you might claim for some extra things which are not in the accounts, which generally would be capital allowances on vehicles and plant and machinery. You'd end up with a profit figure, and the corporation tax is broadly 20% of that. In the computation for an R&D claim, there would essentially be an extra line which would say, and now I'd like to claim some extra R&D expenditure in the amount of such and such, which would equate to all of the parts of the claim, like the staffing costs, maybe subcontractor fees, and maybe consumable materials. It would be enhanced by the relevant rate, and essentially it figures in the computation as a super deduction. So where you might get down to, say, £50,000 worth of corporation tax, profits, and the corporation tax would normally be at 20%, that would be 10,000. If you have £50,000 worth of R&D expenditure to claim, your profits are down to nothing and there's nothing to pay. You've saved £10,000. But the point is, you don't have to go back and amend the accounts. The revenue don't expect you to actually have a deduction somewhere between admin costs and motor expenses, which says R&D costs. They fully anticipate that everything's already been analysed out in its own description already, such as staffing costs or whatever, and we can go in as part of the claim in the computation and pull out the component parts and apply the R&D uplift to those parts. The time limit for claiming, there is basically a time limit for claiming, which is 2 years from the end of the accounting period. And this is the same period where you can go back and amend a company return if it proves to be wrong in either direction. So for example, at the moment, if you have a June accounting date, this should be something you're thinking about quite quickly, because your accounts to June 14 needed to be at HMRC by June 15, and we have until the end of June 16 to amend those and put a claim in. Once you go past the 2 years, if we get to the 1st of July and you phone me up and say I had an awful lot of R&D expenditure in the accounts to June 14, the answer is you're too late. Yes, there are means that you can go back occasionally and amend earlier years. There used to be the old error or mistake relief, which was superseded by overpayments relief. The revenue will not allow you to claim overpayments relief for an R&D claim. They'll just tell you that you're too late and you should have claimed it within time. So don't always stick these things on a back burner. If you've got a more decent accounting date like September and we've got a while to think about it, then that's fine, but don't leave it to the last minute. It does take a little while to pull these things together. What else? Well, When submitting to HMRC, I spent 23 odd years in HMRC, mostly as an investigator, but I did spend a short period of time looking at R&D claims, and I can tell you that there is generally a format that the revenue like to see. They don't just want to see some figures thrown onto a tax return. They would like to see a covering narrative setting out what the claim is about and considering whether it's within the SME scheme or the large company scheme. They want to see supporting schedules, they want an explanation of the R&D activity, and they want to see the amended tax computations and CT 600. Now, any decent R&D professional will be able to do about 95% of that for you. Certainly we will. For cases that I deal with, I would want to at least have a chat with you in the first instance, ideally a meeting, talk about what the R&D is, who's doing it, the sort of level of expenses. And then, to be honest, the vast majority of that can be taken care of by us. If you do go to another firm, that's fine. They should be able to take care of that. The only thing I would ever want from you is I would need you to provide a narrative of the sort of the nature of the R&D that you're undertaking. And again, I've seen people look like rabbits in the headlight. Oh my God, I can't do that. The point is, we've dealt with a load of claims. I have a load of anonymized examples of claims and how people have approached it in cases that have been successful. It's not as hard as you think. It's generally 2, maybe 3 pages of A4 on a Word document. And again, if I provided some anonymized examples of how other people have gone about it, you might be surprised as to how quick it is to pull together. The one thing I would say, again, I'm just going to reinforce again, if you think you're carrying out R&D activities and you're not sure, any decent R&D person would be delighted to speak to you just to talk through whether there's a claim there or whether there isn't. Certainly I would be, and I've given my details out a couple of times already. I will actually go a step further in this webinar and talk about fees, because generally you'll find people won't do that. They'd rather speak to you first, and I think it's only fair just to give you an idea, mainly because I think you'll find we're pretty much one of the cheapest in the field. Any R&D professional will do an R&D claim on a contingent basis, and that's what we do as well. Just to be clear, it is based on a percentage of the tax that's saved as a part of the R&D exercise. Certainly we don't issue a fee note until basically you have either saved money because you've gone past a corporation tax payment date, or you've actually had a cheque in the post. There are no upfront fees. If the claim fails for whatever reason, although I have to say I've never had a claim fail, I'm looking for something wooden to touch as we speak. Basically, if the claim failed, there is absolutely nothing that's payable. But to be honest, I can't see a claim failing, because personally, I wouldn't undertake any sort of claim unless I thought there was a very good chance of it getting through. I would always be delighted to speak to people about that. Our fees, we work on the basis of 20% of the tax saved plus VAT. That fee in itself is an allowable deduction in the company's accounts, but it doesn't form the basis of our fee saving, or else that would be never ending, wouldn't it? If you are speaking to other R&D providers, get them to actually confirm what their fee basis is. I am aware of some specialist firms that go somewhere between 25 and 33%, which, you know, if you're a scheme provider listening to this today, I'm sorry, but I think that's ludicrous. It's far too high. 20% is reasonable. It basically covers us for the risk of something going wrong, and on the odd occasion when HMRC policing the system and asking a few questions, clearly our time is included in that as well. So anyway, it's a flying visit through R&D with a few examples today of what we can claim, generally the claims process, an idea of what R&D is, and hopefully my contact details. I can't actually see any questions. I'm kind of hoping there are people out there that can hear me today. Oh, I've just seen some messages. Yes, I can hear you, Neill. Thank you very much, Sean and Manny and John and Tony and Mario. Thank you very much indeed. There's me sitting in a room thinking I'm talking to myself and going slightly mad. What I can't actually see if there are any questions, but please, you do have my details. Maybe give me 5 or 10 minutes just to have a cup of tea after this. But if you want to phone me at any time throughout the week and talk about R&D, I would love to hear from you, or drop me an email and we can take it from there. So thank you very much. I was planning for this to be about half an hour today. I think I've overrun by 10 minutes. Sorry you haven't seen me speaking. I hope it's been interesting, and I'll let you go now. Thank you very much. You take care. Bye.